Hello, everybody, and welcome to the channel and another episode of South African Coin Talk. And today we have uh, a very interesting talk, and we had this on the table for a long time, but due to heavy schedules and other constraints, we couldn't do the talk. But welcome to Francois Milan, Professor. How are you this morning?
It's going very, very well, Anthony, and thank you very much for inviting me back. It's always very nice giving these presentations. Unfortunately, I've just been incredibly busy over the last year or so. You always ask me for this presentation, and for some reason we never got around doing it. So I'm very glad sitting here this morning, and then we can actually do this presentation.
Yeah, I think, once you released your book as well, there's been a lot of interest in the sovereign, and a lot of people, hopefully, after now getting it firsthand with this presentation, are going to get the insights on the sovereign and some of the coins which come through your hands and you let it slip and I think it's an underestimated area. I never paid a lot of attention to it until your book came out, and it's I think it's going to be fascinating. It's a short series, it's not a long series, so it's not going to be difficult, but some coins are going to be possibly difficult to obtain. But over to you, Francois, and thank you again for joining this channel. I think you've contributed a lot, not only to the channel, but to South African numismatics, and you've been recognized in the industry as an authority on South African numismatics. So thank you once again for accepting the invite.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Just let me share. I'm going to stop my video and I'm going to share the presentation. And here's the presentation, and I am sharing it. So hopefully everybody can see it now. Okay, so the topic, as Anthony alluded, what I want to discuss today is really the Pretoria Sovereign. I call it the Pretoria Sovereign as it was actually minted in very large numbers here in Pretoria. And it's very closely linked to what we call the gold standard crisis here in South Africa. It's a fascinating history. It's a complex history and there's a lot of details. So unfortunately, I cannot cover everything today in this presentation. But all of it is actually written up in that book. So if you miss some of the details, you'll be able to find that in the book. Now, just in terms of these sovereigns, just let me go to the next slide. So the question we need to ask ourselves, why is this a fascinating topic of study? Anthony alluded to this as well. I find it a fascinating series to collect simply for the following reasons. These South African sovereigns, they've actually received very little attention compared to the Krugerponde, for example. And there was the one thing, of course, I love writing these books, and what attracted me to these sovereigns is there's no dedicated numismatic literature that actually wrote up the history of the South African sovereigns. So I was very keen to try something. Of course, the 1932 South African sovereigns were the last gold coins in the British Empire that was actually intended as currency at their face value. So it's a very nice collectible. It's got the lowest mintage figure as well. So that's the one coin of the series you must definitely include quite early on. And then closely linked to that is, not a lot of people know this, but South Africa was one of the few countries where gold coins was in general circulation during the period from 1925 to 1932. And there's a very interesting reason for that, and that is the mining industry preferred to pay the migrant workers in these gold sovereigns. Furthermore, the 1923 and 1924 sovereigns are actually quite rare, and I think they significantly underestimated by collectors. We should actually be paying much more for these coins when they appear on the market, and later on in the presentation, I'm going to talk a bit more about that as well. Amazingly, during a very short period. It was only 8-year period of minting at the Pretoria branch of the Royal Mint. They actually minted 83 million of these sovereigns. That's actually mind-boggling. It's actually more coins minted in 8 years than all the Krugerrands that's been minted since 1967. So they actually worked very hard at the mint in those years. Something that's of significant interest to me as well is the forgeries of the series, and specifically the ones with the SA mint mark. And these forgeries have not been listed and described. And I actually tried to do that to the best of my ability in the book. I couldn't find all of these forgeries, but I found a few. And then the question, the last one on this particular slide is, if you're a collector now, and again, Anthony alluded to this, and you want to collect the series now from 1925 to 1932, how difficult would it be to quickly find a full set of those sovereigns? If you rush out to all the dealers now, would you be able in one go quickly assemble a full set? It's an interesting question. Now, because of my interest in this, I gave a presentation at the Gauteng Numismatic Society. It was probably in the middle of the year or early in 2023. I can't really remember. It was somewhere there in 2023. And I collected more information, and then eventually I published this book in May 2024. I only printed 60 copies of this first edition. I wanted the readers to go through it and just check if they are not mistakes. And I was looking for more of those forgeries, and that's why I wasn't keen to print more copies. So this is a very special edition. So if you, one of the lucky people, able to lay your hands on one of these 60 copies, you are indeed lucky. I'll probably, if there's further requests for books, I'll probably fix a couple of the typos, just include some additional information. So somewhere in the future, we can print a bit more of these books if there is a request for more. Now, because of the significant volume of work in the book, it's impossible, as I mentioned, to cover everything. I'm just going to focus on these 8 topics. And that's, first of all, is the early use of the sovereign in South Africa. Not a lot of people actually realize it was a very important coin in South Africa, and we should actually collect it as a series. And not only the Pretoria sovereigns, but even the early British sovereigns as well. And then closely linked to this is the suspension of the gold standard in the UK during the First World War. But there was interesting developments in South Africa during and after the First World War, and it's worthwhile to pay some attention to that in the presentation. And then fascinating to me, of course, I do a lot of work in the mining industry, is that the gold mines, these migrant workers refused to accept anything else as payment except for these gold sovereigns. And that is what actually forced the South African government to actually start minting these sovereigns again in South Africa. Then we'll have a look at the mintages struck in Pretoria. Then there's a bit of a mystery around this 1924 South African sovereign. I've got some theories and we can discuss that. And there was also a proposed design for a unique South African sovereign. And I include some diagrams on that. And then just some of the forgeries which I was able to collect while I was busy with this project. So let's move on to that first one, which is the early use of the sovereign in South Africa. And there's a lot of evidence, and I can't describe everything, of the early use of these sovereigns at the Cape of Good Hope. For example, the one example I've got there is 1824 sovereign was actually placed in the 1833 foundation stone. They laid that in 1833 of the Dutch Reformed Church, the Nieuwe Kerk, there in Cape Town. That church was demolished, if I remember the date correctly, in 1967, and then they discovered the sovereign. But you can see in the 30s, they were already, those were considered to be the coins in general use. So they were using those sovereigns in the Cape. And also not widely discussed is during the Great Trek, when all those farmers actually migrated from the Cape into the Free State and Transvaal and a bit into Natal. They actually took large numbers of these gold sovereigns in their wagons. Apparently, some of these farmers were quite rich, and there were quite a large number of these sovereigns taken into the interior of South Africa during that great trek. Also interesting is when the diamond mines were opened in the Kimberley area. Of course, everybody flocked to that particular area, and they were trying to mine diamonds. And those the lucky ones that found these good diamonds, they had to sell it for something. So there was a large migration of these gold sovereigns to the Kimberley area, to such an extent that there was a shortage in certain parts of the country of the gold sovereigns. And then just the final point on this particular slide, just to give you an indication of the number of sovereigns, gold sovereigns imported into the country. And of course, these were British sovereigns in those years and a bit of Australian ones. I'll talk about that now. In those few years alone, £5 million worth of sovereigns were imported into South Africa. So a very nice coin to collect because it was part of our numismatic history in the country. And then let's move on to this suspension of the gold standard. Just the origin of this gold standard, the classic gold standard as it was used in the British Empire. So Britain, of course, moved through all those wars with Napoleon, 1815, those years more or less, and their finances weren't in a very good state, and they had to reorganize that. So one of the decisions they made during that period is to move from a bimetallic, which means gold and silver, to only a gold standard in the early 19th century. And at that stage, the famous 21 shilling guinea, gold guinea, was replaced with the 20 shilling sovereign. And that's, of course, called the Great Recoinage of 1816 in the numismatic books. And very important during that time, the 1819 Act for the Resumption of Cash Payments was passed. And that allowed for the convertibility of the Bank of England banknotes into sovereigns. So that established the direct link between a pound note and a gold sovereign. So amazing, you could actually go into the bank and swap your £1 banknote for a gold sovereign. And gradually this expanded in the British Empire. Circulating gold sovereigns were introduced into Australia, New Zealand, the West Indies. And luckily, of course, you need a lot of gold to maintain a gold standard. And luckily, the Californian and Australian gold rushes occurred. That increased the gold supply and it could actually maintain the gold standard. And of course, later on in 1886, the Witwatersrand goldfields were discovered here in South Africa. And of course, that gold was very important for the British Empire to maintain this gold standard, and that's probably one of the leading causes of the Boer War in this country. Okay, so that was the classic gold standard, and it worked very well, but unfortunately World War I broke out. And as I wrote in a previous book, this is not in this particular book, the gold standard effectively died with Archduke Franz Ferdinand on the streets of Sarajevo. Of course, he was assassinated there, and that was the major cause of the start of the First World War. And the problem, as soon as war breaks out, these countries need to fund the war effort, and then they don't have enough gold. They started printing a lot of paper money. They run into deficits, and unfortunately, they cannot maintain the gold standard during those conditions. So what happened in the UK is interesting. So it was essentially the demise of the gold standard in Britain. In July 1914, now that was about the time of the outbreak, just before the outbreak of the First World War, there was absolute panic amongst the public, and they were quite fearful. So they started converting their notes into gold. Because of that old act, they could actually convert their banknotes into gold. And the Bank of England gold reserves, as a result, fell from 27 million pounds to 11 million pounds. And of course, the Bank of England started to panic because they needed all those gold reserves to fund the war, which was probably going to be a long war. And therefore, they introduced these £1 and 10 shilling banknotes as a replacement for the gold coins. And of course, it was signed by the Secretary of the Treasury. I think his surname was Bradbury. So these banknotes acquired the nickname the Bradbury banknotes. It's interesting, I'm still trying to find two of these notes for my collection. They're actually quite expensive if you find them on the international market, probably simply for this reason. It was a very historic period in the UK. Interestingly, in the UK, conversion into gold was not forbidden. So it wasn't written in law that you can't go and swap your banknotes for coins. But the government kindly requested the public not to do it and to actually hand in their sovereigns. And it's an interesting question if we in a similar situation in South Africa now with all these coin collectors actually willingly go and hand in all their gold coins to support the country. The public was very patriotic in those years. So by mid-1915, sovereigns were actually rarely seen in circulation in the UK. And amazingly, before World War I, look at that number, 100 million of these sovereigns was the estimate, was actually in circulation. So it was in general use, general everyday use. You went to the shop and you actually did your shopping with these gold coins. And then a year later, these coins were rarely seen. In comparison, however, in South Africa, okay, here's just another slide on that. How did they manage to actually withdraw all those sovereigns? These were the words of the Chancellor in the UK, David Lloyd George. I think it was just 2 days after the outbreak of the war, and he was in a way threatening the people. He said, anyone who from selfish motives or greed or from excessive caution or cowardice, very strong words, goes out of his way to attempt to withdraw sums of gold and appropriate them to his own use, let it be clearly understood that he's assisting the enemies of his native land. So he was, as a good politician, he was telling the people to be patriotic and rather go and hand in your sovereigns. And for example, you could do it at the post office where you could actually go and invest in those war loans. And the people did it. It actually worked very well. South Africa, interestingly enough, was actually different. And the gold standard was not suspended during World War I. So gold coin circulated freely in South Africa at that time. However, they had to protect the stocks of coins and gold in the country. So there was a ban on the export of gold from November 1914. And it makes sense because, remember, there was a lot of enemy ships on the high seas and German submarines, and you can actually lose some of this gold. So it's better not to export it at that time. But the South African banks were very worried because, remember, at that stage, we didn't have a local South African mint to mint these coins. So all of our sovereigns were imported from either Australia or the UK. And because of England didn't want to send ships with vast amounts of sovereigns because of that submarine problem, so what can the South Africans do? So they were even in those early years and months in 1914 plans to mint a unique South African sovereign. We couldn't mint the sovereign as it appears there in that picture because there was no royal branch of the mint in this country. So we produced our own design even for the sovereign. You can actually see it there on the right-hand side. I was very fortunate. I stumbled upon this particular design when I was at a visit at our own South African mint currently, and you can see the date on that. It's very faint, but it's indicated as 1914. Unfortunately, this was never minted because this would have been a lovely addition to our numismatic collections. But the government made plans to continue importing coins from other countries, and it was mostly from, interestingly, Australia. Australia was still minting a lot of these sovereigns. So we imported, I've got the figures in the book, but it was in excess of 3 million sovereigns during those war years, most of them from Australia. And you will find a lot of sovereigns in South Africa with these Australian mint marks, with the Perth, the P, the Melbourne M, and the Sydney S mint marks. They circulated in South Africa, so we can probably consider them as, in a way, part of the South African series. So you can add that to your series of collectibles. It all went well, so we could maintain the circulation of gold coins, but then unfortunately problems started at the end of the war. Strangely enough, during the war we were okay, but after the war, of course, the finances in the UK was in a horrible state. And one of the things they did, they dropped that wartime pegging of the dollar British sterling exchange rate. And that suddenly caused the British pound to depreciate. So it depreciated from 85 shillings to 127 shillings per ounce of gold by February 1920. So it significantly dropped against gold. And South Africa didn't follow suit. So they tried to play both sides of the coin. So they maintained parity with between the South African pound and the British sterling pound. But the South African pound, you could still exchange for a gold coin at the banks. And this resulted in extensive smuggling of gold coin out of South Africa, because the guys would go to the banks, offer their South African pounds, get sovereigns, export it to the UK, and then suddenly get 127 shillings per ounce of gold. So they made fat profit. And then the banks on this side actually carried the cost. They had to buy gold in coin to ensure this convertibility of our banknotes at a premium, and then pay it out in South Africa at par. So they were running this operation at a massive loss. So the banks actually pleaded with the government, please release us from this obligation to convert the banknotes into gold coin. And that resulted in this very famous gold conference in Pretoria in October 1990. And that was very important for South Africa. It's a historic meeting, because it was suggested there we must, as soon as possible, get a local refinery, which eventually became Rand Refinery, and we must get a local mint that we can actually mint our own coins. The government, Jan Smuts, he was still the premier. He wasn't in favor of dropping this convertibility of the banknotes into gold coins. But luckily, this British banker, Henry Strakosch, he was very influential. He arrived, and he was apparently very smart. He was at that conference as well. He arrived in January 1920, and he actually changed everybody's minds. And he was very influential to create this Currency and Banking Act of 1920. And I'm referring to the, before I move on, local refinery. There's an early photograph of Rand Refinery, very important institution for South Africa. But this 1920 Currency and Banking Act was very important for South Africa, because look how the interesting two aspects in the first sentence in that particular act. So it states there, this act is to conserve the specie supplies, now that's the gold coins, the sovereigns of the Union, by providing for the issue of gold certificates. So that's where these famous gold certificates come from this act. And then in the same sentence, to provide for the establishment of the Central Reserve Bank for the Union. So that was the birth of our Reserve Bank. And so these gold certificates has got a very interesting link with our Reserve Bank as well. So there's just the wording for that. So this act now suddenly, to protect our gold coins, allowed for the issue of gold certificates And these gold certificates could not be redeemed for gold if the price exceeded a certain value. And I've written it there on the screen. And that's, in fact, the very old value of which was adopted in 1770 by Isaac Newton when he was still master of the mint in London. So in December 1920, the government proclamation enforced this particular act, and then suddenly the gold coins were not in circulation anymore. And to the banks, these gold certificates were issued. So by 1925, so there were a 4-year period where, or almost 4-year period where these gold coins didn't circulate. And by the end of that period, 10.5 million pounds of these certificates were issued. Now, just an important statement. So part of the act was that Treasury may request banks to deposit gold coins at the Treasury, and then they get these gold certificates, and there was a fine if you as a bank don't do it very quickly. But interestingly enough, the public was not mentioned in this act. This is very important. So if you had 10 sovereigns in your pocket, there was no need to rush off to and to go and exchange that for gold certificates. Now, these gold certificates are a very interesting set of notes. You can see the denominations was quite large. There was a 1 and a 5, which is small, but then it jumps to £100, £1,000, and £10,000. So just the notes you see there on the screen, if we add all the values in pounds and you can and you swap these for gold sovereigns at the current gold price, these notes, unfortunately, are cancelled. But if they're not cancelled, this set of notes would be worth 142 million rand. Absolutely staggering how the gold price actually increased since those times. For the collectors, if you collect the gold sovereigns, of course, it would be a very nice addition to have a full set of these gold certificates as part of your collection. But let me tell you, it's incredibly difficult to find a complete set. I think in my 30 years of being involved in numismatics, I've only ever seen 2 complete sets of these gold certificates. So they're incredibly difficult to find. And the reason for that is that by March 1926, only £60. Most of these notes were held at the banks. And of course, they were destroyed when they were redeemed again. But by March 1926, only £60 were in the hands of the public. And we've got records to confirm that. So that's the problem. If it was only £60, the public couldn't keep any of these banknotes as souvenirs. And that's why they're so difficult to find as collectibles. So that was up to 1925. And then luckily South Africa returned to the gold standard. And what caused that is there was a change in government. Hertzog became the premier in 1924. Smuts lost the election. Hertzog was in favor of a return to the gold standard. And he wanted South Africa to be much more independent of the UK. So he favored this return to the gold standard. And then that government of his actually invited these 2 gentlemen, that Prof. Kemmerer and Dr. Fisher. And Kemmerer was a professor at Princeton University in the US. And Fishing was from the Netherlands. I think he was from the central bank there. And it's typical how politics work. These 2 gentlemen, of course, are in favor of a gold standard. So if you want to go back to the gold standard, just get some friends who agree with you. And they were invited across. They did their interviews. It's written up in that report that's displayed there on the screen as well. And obviously, at the end of that study, they recommended a return to the gold standard. But interestingly enough, the Great Britain actually jumped us. What's the correct English? They actually went back to the gold bullion standard before we did. On 27 April 1925, they went back to a gold standard, but it was slightly different to their earlier gold standard because the currency could only be redeemed in 400-ounce bars. Now, of course, that's incredibly expensive, so nobody in the public actually took their few notes to go and buy those bars. But South Africa adopted the old standard again. So they were back on the so-called gold specie standard of circulating coins during May 1925. So the gold coins were in circulation again. And that's why we've got this nice series of collectibles. And here is the government gazette where it was actually announced that we're going to start using gold coins again. And it's amazing when you look at this government gazette. It's a very short paragraph just stating that we no longer going to use these gold certificates, and therefore the gold coins are back in circulation. Now, the grouping in South Africa that played a very strong role for South Africa to go back on the gold standard was the gold mines. And just a bit of the history of that and the reason they preferred the gold coins. That's just a repeat. So the mining industry played a very strong role in the reintroduction of these coins. And the reason for that is these migrant workers, especially out of Mozambique, preferred the gold coins. Now, every year they recruited approximately 40,000 of these mine workers in Mozambique. They worked here for approximately a year, and each of them, when they returned to Mozambique, carried approximately 12 pounds in gold in their pockets. And the reason for that is there was established customs in Mozambique that they use these gold in their social and tribal dealings. For example, the Bola money, if you wanted to buy a wife, was 8 to 10 pounds in gold. You can't buy your wife in paper money. You had to give decent gold coins for a nice wife. And therefore, these workers actually needed the gold coins. And the Portuguese government actually assisted with this. In 1928, they regulated the recruitment of those Mozambican mine workers and stipulated in the contracts all the payments should actually happen in gold. So unfortunately, the mines had no choice. They had to pay these workers in gold. But there was a very good other reason why gold was preferred. Amongst the workers, banknotes were incredibly unpopular because in the compounds where they lived, there were no safe storage for them to store their gold coins. And then if you take these paper notes underground, it's wet, soggy, the humidity is very high. These banknotes didn't survive underground where the gold coins did. So you could actually take the gold coins underground, but not the banknotes. And so the mine bosses understood this. And just an example is the Big Crown mines. It was at that time, it was the biggest gold mine in the world. And the chairman of the board was Samuel Evans, Dr. Samuel Evans, a very interesting character. And he was in favor of this gold standard as well, a return to a gold coin standard. So he was very well connected. He had connections with the Treasury and the Royal Mint. He had regular correspondence with Kemmerer, which I discussed on the previous slide. And the new Minister of Finances in Hertzog's government was Nick Rouwenga, and he found a very good ally amongst those ministers who also wanted to return to a gold coin standard. And both Kemmerer and Evans saw a restoration of the gold standard as a part of the global struggle over the future of gold. Just think about it. You're the chairman of the biggest gold mine in the world. You produce gold. And therefore, it's in your interest to maintain a gold standard because then there will always be demand for your particular product. And that's why actually fought so hard for that. And just, I couldn't resist including this. It's probably got nothing to do with the sovereign. This is an old underground mine plan of Crown Mines in 1930 when they paid those workers in gold sovereigns. It was a vast complex underground. For example, you can see the position of those of you familiar with Johannesburg and the Crown Interchange. There you see the approximate position of the Crown Interchange. And 5 Shaft was a very famous shaft because that's where all the hoisting of the ore actually took place, and that's the position. And then further to the south, it was 14 Shaft, and that eventually became Gold Reef City, and you can still visit that shaft and go underground there, and you can see all those shafts are interconnected with tunnels. So if you really get lost there at Gold Reef City, you can probably walk and try to walk out to one of the shallower shafts and actually climb out there. And you can see it was even quite deep in those years. It's going down to a depth of 2,000 meters. Just another comment on these mine workers and the sovereigns. This is a very nice quote from one of those machine drillers underground. There on the left, you see the conditions underground, and you can see they are soaking wet. It's incredibly wet and humid there underground. They're doing some exploration drilling there. Just imagine in your clothing there, which you see there in front of you, if you need to keep banknotes safe, it would be impossible. And this person who made this quote was one of these machine drillers at East Rand Proprietary Mines in the Boksburg area. And he said about these sovereigns, it is better because even if you eat it, it remains money. It doesn't get soaked in rain, it still remains money. The paper money is different because you must always be careful. It's something that can be torn anytime. It can get wet. Money with dignity that you can feel when you're handing it is this red money. And of course, he was referring to the sovereigns because sometimes they had a reddish tint. And just as a nice example, there you see an old South African £1 note of 1928, a sovereign of 1928. If you were a mine worker, which one of those methods of payment would you prefer? So obviously, and we as collectors would probably take the gold coin as well. Just to give you an indication how many of these gold coins they paid every week, on the left-hand side is Crown Mines number 5 shaft. Very nice old historic picture of that shaft. And that Crown Mines paid out more than 12,000 gold sovereigns every week. Amazing to think that there were so many of those sovereigns in circulation. A different mining group, Rand Mines, paid out 3.1 million sovereigns in weekly wages during 1927. It was a massive operation. And that's why our Pretoria Mint had to produce so many of these sovereigns. And the total wage bill for the African workers on the gold mines between 1925 and 1933 were 9 million pounds per year. And those were all paid in gold sovereigns. But unfortunately, the good times didn't last. And the final act in the gold standard crisis was, unfortunately, the Wall Street crash of 1929. And of course, that led to the Great Depression that followed 1929. Great Britain unexpectedly, because of the financial troubles caused by the Great Depression, suspended the gold bullion standard on 21 September 1931. So you couldn't even go and buy those 400-ounce bars anymore with your banknotes anymore. Now, the South African government were again stubborn because they still wanted to retain the gold standard, independent from Britain. They needed it for the payment of the migrant gold mine workers. But unfortunately, this caused problems now. And the South African economy started struggling. Immediately, the South African pound strengthened against the British pound. And because of that, we couldn't export anymore. So the world market was very poor, weak because of the depression anymore. And suddenly our prices became very expensive. So especially agriculture and the mining commodities outside of the gold sector struggled significantly. So they were heated debates. These politicians were shouting at one another. And especially between Hertzog, who wanted to retain the gold standard, and the South African party, Jan Smuts, who wanted to get rid of the gold. And because of this mess in the politics, this famous politician, Tielman Roosie, was retired. He decided to enter politics again. And a lot of people say he played quite a strong role in South Africa stepping off the gold standard. And then that same panic, which happened during the First World War, happened in South Africa on 23 December, the public panic, and they wanted to convert all their Reserve Bank notes into gold, and 3 million gold coins, South African sovereigns, were withdrawn in 3 days. The Reserve Bank started to panic, and they said this cannot be survived. So on 28 December 1932, the South African Reserve Bank's notes ceased to be convertible into gold coins. And that was the end of, amazingly, the end of circulating gold coins in South Africa. And it's only we as collectors that actually really see gold coins on a regular basis. The public don't really see them. And very closely linked to this is America followed in a dramatic manner. That was Roosevelt that signed his executive order in April, early April. So it was only 3 months after South Africa, and the poor Americans had to hand in their gold. It was worse than South Africa. We didn't have to hand in our gold sovereigns, but the Americans had to do it under severe penalties if you didn't do that. Now, there were 83 million South African sovereigns minted. So where are they? I remember my earlier question, how easy is it to collect a full set? From 25 to 32, almost 39 million of those coins were shipped to the UK, and amazingly, they were melted by the Bank of England because of the gold bullion standard. They needed the gold bars, not the actual coins. So we were minting the coins on that side to be exported to the UK, just to be melted in England again. So in total, and I'll show a table now, 82 million of this 83 million SA sovereigns were officially exported, and probably the bulk of that was actually melted. So in spite of the very large mintage figure, these coins have probably become quite scarce. So early in 1933, when we stepped off the gold standard, the public, of course, tried to make profit from their sovereigns, because the South African pound, of course, weakened, so they could get more for their gold coins. So some of these coins were actually melted down by jewelers, and there was no law prohibiting anybody from purchasing these coins or melting them down. So it was different compared to America. Initially, there was some confusion. The newspapers actually reported there's a strict legal ban and heavy penalties if you actually melt these coins. But later on, there was a letter from the Secretary of Finance that stating there's absolutely no law. You can actually do with these coins what you actually want. So one can actually only guess that a lot of these coins were actually melted down and exported to other countries where you could actually get more for these coins. These are the countries where those 82 million coins were exported to. So you see there the names of Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Dutch East India, India, United Kingdom, and others, a few of the African countries. And the bulk of those were actually exported to India and the UK. And the UK coins were definitely melted. Just a bit on the mintage figures again. Just a point to highlight. This is old photographs of our Pretoria branch of the Royal Mint. And it actually it's fantastic seeing these old photographs, but one needs to be honest, it looks quite primitive. So it's absolutely amazing how innovative these engineers and people working in the mint were in those years, with that equipment to have been able to mint 83 million sovereigns in only 80 years, in 8 years. And these sovereigns have very fine tolerances as prescribed in the law, so you had to be exceedingly precise. So what a fantastic achievement. And just some of these stats, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. In total, Arendt published this in 1939. Apparently, 1.1 billion sovereigns were minted in total, right from the start, from 1870 till 1932, when we minted the last official ones. But in the last few years, the bulk of these ones, these sovereigns, were actually minted in South Africa. So proudly South African. That's where the last of these sovereigns were. Such a famous coin, so we in South Africa can actually be proud that the last of these ones were actually minted here in South Africa. Now, just in terms of the mintage figures, there's some confusion regarding the 1923 mintages and the 1924 mintages. And I had a careful look in the old records of the annual reports of the Royal Mint. And luckily, all these mintage figures are very carefully described in those old annual reports. And the confusion regarding these mintage figures really arises from the fact that the 1923 proof sovereign was minted in both 1923 and 1924. So when you look at the total numbers, for example, of 1924, just remember not all of those coins were actually dated 1924. Some of those were 1923 proof coins. And because of that, one can actually deduce the actual mintage figures. So 1923, the total mintage was definitely 719 sovereigns. That's included in the annual report of the Royal Mint. But 406 of those coins were definitely not proof. We've got very good proof of that. So you can immediately see only approximately half of the proof 1923 sovereigns were minted in 1923. And if you do all the calculations, it's described in detail in the book. I cannot go through it now. It's actually boring statistics, but it's very clearly spelled out. So there's the correct mintage figures that should really appear in the coin catalogs. So just for normal circulation coins, 1923, there's 406, and that not the smaller amount as a lot of people believe. The total proof coins is definitely 655, but some were minted in 23 and some in 24. And the 1924 mintage is slightly smaller as a result of that, and it's 2821. So you can immediately see the 23 mintages are very small, the 24 mintages are small. Those coins are rare and they are expensive, and they should probably be even more expensive. Through the annual reports, I actually confirmed the mintage figures of the other years from 25 to 32, and those are spot on as they actually currently appear in our coin catalogs. And another important aspect is you can see 1932, we were the only country in the world still minting those sovereigns officially, and only 1 million were minted. And of course, some of those were, a large number of those were melted. So of the normal series, that 1932 one is probably the most difficult to find and should be the most expensive. Just in terms of, there were some design changes to these coins. And I was very curious when I wrote this book. I never carefully looked at these coins. So I took very careful photographs of these coins. And there you can see after 1929, from 1929 onwards, the head was a bit smaller. You can see at the top of the coin on the right, there's suddenly a gap that appears there, and there's a tiny gap at the bottom. So the head was definitely much smaller. and then the initials of the engraver, BM, is actually at a different position and a different style as well. And even more important distinction is just look at the rim of the coin, the edge of the coin. Say where it had teeth in 1923, you can see from 1929 onwards. I don't know how to describe that. It's the spoked wheel pattern from 1929 onwards that also appears on the other side, on the reverse side of the coin. Also important, the books always refer to there was a change in, it's the small lead sovereign. That's the emphasis in many of the catalogs, but the design on the reverse also changed. So it was also made slightly smaller. So you can see the field of the date has increased significantly in size. And if you look carefully at these photographs, you can do it in your own time. You can see that the design on the right-hand side after 1929 was actually simplified as well. There's much more finer detail in the design in the 1923 coin. So the 1923 design is actually the beautiful one. And also different was just there was a slight change to the position of the SA. It's much easier to read and distinguish in the coins 1929 and onwards. Okay, the thing that intrigued me is why was the 1924 coin minted? There were almost, well, as we stated on an earlier slide, there were 2,800 of these 1924 sovereigns minted. Why were they minted? Because remember, we stated that South Africa was only back on a gold coin standard from May 1925. So why on earth would the South Africa or the Royal Mint in Pretoria mint these 24 sovereigns? Apparently, according to Orange, they received some gold from the National Bank in 1924 and they minted these coins. In the archives, the National Archives, I could actually find the audit records from the mint. And there's two dates. They had to do it twice a year, 31 March and 30 September. And both of those audit records indicate that there were 900 pounds of sovereigns in stock. Unfortunately, they don't give the date, but we can, I think it's safe to assume they were probably all 1924 sovereigns. Interestingly, there were 2,800 minted of those 24 sovereigns. So when was the rest minted? Was it actually minted after 30 September 1924? I don't know. The P&G catalog, that famous catalog of the 1980s, 1981, they state that there's a legend that a large part of these 24 coins were exported to East Africa and melted. But I couldn't find any records of exports during 1924, and Arendt even states the only exports from 1925 onwards. My theory is that the mint master the deputy mint master was very well aware that we're going to go back onto the gold standard from 1925, and he had to start preparing the mint and make sure the equipment is ready for this large minting of the new sovereigns that's coming. Now, incredibly fine tolerances are required to meet the weight specification of these sovereigns. It's described in the book. I'm not going to go through those numbers, but it's staggering how carefully they had to operate the equipment to meet those fine tolerances. So one possible theory is that they actually had to test the equipment. They installed new rollers, which is described in some of the records. So my question is, was these 1924 sovereigns minted to test the new mint equipment before the big rush in 1925? And if it was just minted as a test, they were probably stored there at the mint. they were probably mixed with the other coins and released to the public. And because their numbers were so small compared to the other sovereign dates, they probably were just melted and disappeared because nobody were collecting it in those years. So there's a nice theory to chew on for you. So how rare is this 1924 coin? We can compare the grading numbers, and I collected these numbers last year. So it was, it's now a year ago when I collected these numbers, and this is the combined grading totals for both NGC and PCGS. There you see the numbers. The green ones are the sovereigns. The proof, the two tall bars are the 1923 proof sovereign and proof half sovereign, and they're quite large, they're almost 200. But interestingly enough, look there, the 1924 sovereign is only 89 graded last year, March. Whereas, compared to the fine beard Burgers Point, there's 93 graded. So is that 1924 sovereign actually more rare than the fine beard Burgers Point? There's another question for you to chew on. And if that is in fact the case, we should probably pay the same for these 24 sovereigns, which we pay for a fine beard Burgers Point. Another interesting question to chew on. Okay, we're almost finished. During that period, when we went back onto the gold standard, there was a feeling perhaps South Africa should move away from the British pound, design our own coin, mint it. We prepared proposals. It was studied by the Royal Mint in London. Even a draft bill was produced by Pearson from our local branch mint. And here's some of the designs they proposed. There was a flying wheel, some animals, and even a jumping springbok, which is very similar to what later appeared on the silver one rand coins. One of the designs they played with was one of these voortrekker, these Boer figures, and it was one of the secondary statues underneath Paul Kruger there on Church Square, and a drawing was even prepared there at the Mint, and I was luckily that drawing actually survived as well, and I was able to photograph there, and you can actually see the date there. 27 February 1925 was this design prepared. Again, it would have been nice if this was produced, another coin in our collection, but unfortunately it never happened. This proposal was never adopted, and unfortunately I couldn't find any records why. The letters from the Royal Mint in the UK actually stopped at a particular point. And the last one I could find was dated 7 May 1925. It was this Colonel Johnson, who was the mint master there. And he had quite a threatening tone. We should feel bound either to suspend the royal proclamation which authorizes British gold coins to be struck at Pretoria, or even possibly cease to recognize Pretoria as a branch mint at all. Now, just think about it. If that, if they followed through on that, we would have never had the South African sovereigns with the SA mint mark. So luckily sanity prevailed, and that was possibly the reason they didn't push this local South African design much harder, and we started minting the British coins. Just remember, when you collect this series, there will be forgeries floating around. And what worried me is that all these forgeries, everybody talks about these forgeries, but it's never been properly described and photographed for a book that we can actually just compare the coins we've got in our hands to these forgeries. Good quality photographs were not readily available, and we know there were these counterfeits and forgeries. For example, the 1924 forgery is described as early as 1965. It is one of those Beagles magazine, and then somebody actually picked up that there's a fake 1924 sovereign. And of course, it's worthwhile making a forgery of that particular coin because it's so expensive. And in the P&G catalog, they make this intriguing statement: beware of forgeries in most dates. So I'm very keen to collect a forgery of every single date, and believe me, I haven't been successful to date. So I wonder how many of these forgeries have actually been melted over the years as well. And just to give you some photographs of these forgeries, here's the 1924 forgery. And it's actually got a low 4. It's very easy to identify once you know what to look for. Just look at the 4, and there's an enlargement on the right. The genuine coin is the upper photograph, and just below it is the forgery. And you can see the 4 is lower, and just look carefully, the shape of the 4 is also different. So you can immediately, if you've got a loop, you can immediately identify this forgery. This 24 is an incredibly expensive coin, so be careful. This particular coin, in fact, was slabbed as genuine. So even the people slabbing these coins can occasionally make mistakes with these things. And another thing to look out at the P, the engraver's initials. There's a full stop after the B, but not after the P. So that's a giveaway as well. There's one forgery. Here's a nice 1925 forgery. And in fact, I see I made a mistake on the slides. The genuine one is actually the lower photograph. The upper one is the forgery. So just keep in mind that's the forgery on top. And you can see the letters are a different shape compared to the genuine coin. And again, similar, there's not a full stop after the P of the BP. And if you look closely at the coin, the fields don't look right. It's probably a cast coin as well. Here's a 1928 forgery. And the easy way to identify these coins is just look at the rim or the edge, and you can see there's almost no detail. So that fine detail on the edge is gone. There's a bit of detail here on the reverse, but it's actually missing there on the left-hand side as well. And you typically see these striations, many of these striations on the obverse, which you actually sometimes see with these cast coins. And then in the Middle East, they made a lot of replicas of the sovereigns, but with a lower gold content. They were typically minted with 21 carats of gold and not 22. And to identify them as lower grade coins, these hallmarks were actually added. There on the left, you see AA21 to indicate it's 21 carats. Unfortunately, some people confuse these coins with possibly patterns that were struck. For example, in one of the catalogs, this particular coin on the left is described as a unique pattern, and it's actually listed there as at the price of 150,000 Rand. But in fact, it's not a unique pattern. It's simply a replica that was actually struck there in the Middle East. And there's another mint mark on the right, 22 carats. But when you scan that with one of these handheld XRF machines, it's definitely not 22 carats. It's actually 21 as well. So just be careful of these replicas. And they're very shiny, very yellowish as well. So you can actually distinguish them quite easily. And Anthony, that is the end of my collection. I was recently in Australia towards the end of last year. I was in Australia, and it was actually fantastic to see all these coin shops in Sydney that's actually selling these sovereigns with the Australian mint marks. And of course, if you're a South African collector now, you'll realize now after this presentation, these Australian sovereigns with the Australian mint marks is really part of our collection as well. So whenever you're in Australia, just go and pick up these mint marks for you at slightly above bullion price. Thank you very much.
Wow, that's a fascinating journey of the sovereign, Francois. You just want to turn your video on there, Francois?
Yes, just let me, I want to stop this presentation mode. Just let me see if I can actually get it right. I'm struggling to unfreeze this. There we go. The screen sharing has stopped, and let me turn on the video again.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
I can see. Yeah, that's
They
fascinating. It is absolutely amazing the history behind a single coin.
yes,
And
that
like you said,
is.
you haven't covered every aspect of it.
This is probably only 10% what is written up in the book. So it's definitely worthwhile. Now I'm shooting myself in the foot. It's definitely worthwhile getting a copy of this book. But now everybody's going to pester me because it's not readily available. Um, but but of course, Anthony, that's a very important comment because this is the fascinating aspect of coin collecting and numismatics. It's just starting to dig into the history of these coins, and then all these fantastic historic aspects actually come to the front, and that's the real joy of coin collecting and numismatics. It's not really owning the coins. Really, it's doing this research behind the coins.
Yeah. Just tell me, in your opinion, okay, when we started minting the coins, the sovereign here in South Africa, any, I mean, most of our coins have got South Africa on it, or South Africa, or Zuid Africa. The sovereign
Yes.
never had the country name on it.
Yes, there's a very good reason for that because the Mintage Act in the UK, 1871, if I recall correctly. Of course, they had the Royal Mint there in London, but that Mintage Act made provision for the establishment of branch mints. And therefore, branch mints were established in Australia, in the three different cities, in Canada for 1 year, in India, and South Africa. Now, for example, the Pretoria branch of the Royal Mint was considered to be just an extension of the Royal Mint. And therefore, it's got the right to actually mint sovereigns that's identical to the ones minted in the UK. And for all practical purposes, they were considered identical. And therefore, they were restricted. Not the right words. There was very strict quality control. So every year, on an annual basis, our mint master had to send a few of our sovereigns to the UK for the so-called trial of pics, just to make sure that the coins actually still meet the specifications as specified in the Act. And therefore, even if the coin was minted in South Africa, it was legal tender in the UK. That's why during the First World War, we could actually import the Australian sovereigns and we can use them as just as normal sovereigns in this country. And that's
Yeah,
why South Africa didn't appear on that coin except for that tiny mint mark,
the
which
SA.
is, yeah, the SA. And that mint mark, if the lighting is not right and you don't hold the coin right, especially some of the Australian mint marks, it's very difficult to actually finding that mint mark, especially the Perth one. That P is sometimes very difficult to see, in fact.
Yeah, amazing to know that these coins actually circulated in this country, and you're
Yes.
absolutely correct in saying that whilst it circulated here, one should actually try and collect them because it forms part of our
Yes.
currency.
Yeah. Part of the sorting when the gold certificates were issued, eventually all the actual sovereigns ended up in the mint safes. And in 1924, they started sorting those sovereigns for reissuing in 1925. And the mint master actually wrote that of those sovereigns in their possession, 760,000, it's a huge number, were in fact Australian sovereigns in mint condition. And those were probably the sovereigns that were shipped across during the First World War, and they were never issued. They were probably just stored in the bank somewhere. And when the gold certificates were issued, they were transferred to the mint. So 760,000 Australian sovereigns is a huge number, and those were used by the population. So and we never really bothered to actually collect those Australian sovereigns.
Yeah, I think the thing that surprised me the most is the number of sovereigns that were paid out by these mining industries to their staff. I mean, that's a frightening number of sovereigns.
Yes. Yeah, my wife, it's interesting, she laughs at me when she saw those figures. She says, yeah, Franco, you would probably just because you want the sovereigns, you would probably go and mine for those guys just to earn your weekly sovereign.
Yeah, that's frightening. Interesting point that you made out here is, and this we need to try and get corrected in the catalogs, is
Yes.
mintage of the 23 sovereign. I mean, we've got
Yes.
it at 719, which we know 655 is the proof mintage.
That's spot on because that's in the annual report of the Royal Mint.
So the actual figure for 23 should be 1061.
Yeah. It's still the total for 1923 is 719. No, just let me go into the book because I haven't got the presentation open in front of me. The total mintage for 1923.
You said 455 non-proof.
So it's interesting. I cannot find it. Yeah, here's the correct mintages. So the total for 1923 is definitely 719.
Right.
That's the maximum that was minted in 1923. And of that 719, 406 were circulation coins.
Oh, okay.
Normal coins.
Okay.
So only deduct here, I can't do the sum in my head now. I'm tired of the presentation. 719 minus 406 was proof coins minted in 1923. And the remainder of the proof coins were minted in 1924. And they were added to the total of the 1924 one. So the 1924 circulation coins, normal coins, were actually less than the 3,148, which is currently specified in the catalogs.
Okay. So the actual proof mintage for 23 is much lower.
Look, there were no 1924 proof coins. So the only proof coins minted in 1924 was the remainder of the coins dated 1923.
Okay.
So in the catalogs, you will also see there's no proof mintage in 1924, but it was quite sneaky. There was a run over from the 1923. They weren't finished with those proof sets. That's a problem. And the Empire exhibition was only, if I recall correctly now, I must just read the book again, but the Empire exhibition was only in 1924. And they sold these long sets there at the Empire exhibition at Wembley Stadium in London.
That was in the red box, the Mappin and Webb box, right?
That came later. I'm not sure if that red box was already available at that stage, but there was the wooden box that actually contained the long set as well.
Right.
There's actually a photograph of that. I've got a photograph of that somewhere in the presentation. So both the long and the short set you got in those normal boxes of those years, and then later on, I think the red Mappin and Webb box actually came. It's actually a very good question. I don't know, Anthony, when that red boxes were manufactured. Perhaps they were for the Wembley, for the Empire exhibition.
Interesting note here in Hearn's catalogue. I've just pulled out an old catalogue. He says here in 1923, a mint official purchased 19 uncirculated pounds at the time of issue. These are rare, and the coin prices indicated in the catalogue are for EF to F, impaired proofs.
Yeah, look, that's of course a very good question, and I saw that as well. I couldn't find any confirmation of that official who actually purchased those coins. In the annual reports of the Royal Mint, they very clearly state that that one person actually delivered the deposit of gold, which was jewelry. That was melted and refined, and that gave 406, and those coins were handed back to the depositor. And then there were only the official functions where they actually struck the first proof coins, and one of those coins were sent as a gift to the king. And some of the other officials actually got those proof coins as well. So we will have to find proof that those uncirculated coins were actually bought by a mine official. The one person who would have been interested in those coins were the first managing director, I can't remember his title, of Rand Refinery. Of course, was an ex-employee of the Royal Mint. He was actually in charge of the Bombay, the Indian branch of the Royal Mint as well. And then the Chamber of Mines, when they started Rand Refinery, of course, it was a private initiative. They actually initially pulled him in to assist with the erection of Rand Refinery. And then he became as an employee of Rand Mines, Chamber of Mines. And of course, he had very close interaction with the Mint because he had to supply the gold. So my guess would be that Mint official who would have been interested in these coins was him, and I actually forgot his name now. That's a problem of a frustrated professor, because you sometimes can't remember all these names. But of course, that whole history is actually written up in the book as well.
So interesting to know that the sovereign actually had two designers, one for the obverse and one for the reverse.
Yes, and that's the St. George on horse and the dragon, fighting the dragon. Of course, that's the famous design from 1816, who was done by the Italian sculptor. Worried to pronounce his name because I'm probably going to mess it up. Benedetto Pastrucci.
Yes.
So that's where the BP comes from. But when George V actually became the king, they needed a new design after Queen Victoria. And then, strangely enough, that was actually an Australian. It wasn't somebody in the UK. It was an Australian, Bertram McKennell. And that's where the BM comes from. And it's his design of King George V. That's where the BM comes from.
I just got one final question for you around the forgeries. Have you handled any forgeries? Have you?
Yes, those photographs I took, I was fortunate to have been able to actually take those photographs. So I've actually handled the forgeries.
Is the weight of those coins 7.32 and the caratage of the coin 22 carat?
Yes. Now, this is typically, as a scientist or an engineer, now I need to admit I actually messed it up because I never weighed those coins. So that's part of the future and outstanding work, is just to find these forgeries, all of them, weigh them, scan them with one of those XRF scanners, and just see do they conform to the specifications and how much gold do they contain. And in fact, on that particular point, we must actually do it with all the ZAR forgeries as well.
Yeah.
We haven't scanned those ZAR forgeries.
So I remember some time back, and when I wasn't so interested in the sovereigns, is I had two sovereigns in my hand. For the life of me, I cannot figure out what dates they were. But the colors were different. One was your yellow, and one was more reddish
Yes.
yellow.
Yeah, look, that yellow one, I'll be immediately suspicious because of the color of the gold they actually use for the mintage in the Middle East. And there's a lot of papers being written on those coins that was produced in the Middle East, they the people were familiar with the sovereign. And then, of course, the problem started when South Africa stopped minting sovereigns in 1932. So the source of sovereigns dried up. So we couldn't export coins to the Middle East anymore. So they were keen to continue with the sovereign, and they started minting their own thing. But there were laws in some of those Middle Eastern countries against forgeries. And that's why they added those mint marks, just to circumvent the requirements of that law. But the gold I actually used there is much more yellowish, even though it was 21 karat or less. I don't know if there was a bit of silver added, so it didn't add that reddish color of the true sovereigns, the real
Yeah,
sovereigns.
I think what I picked up as well, and you highlighted, is the number of coins that were sent back to the UK to be melted. I mean, almost 40 million.
Yeah,
And if you take the total mintage and what was left, and if you look at how many of these coins could have gone into the melting pot as well, the surviving sovereigns can't be very many.
you answering the question I asked at the beginning of the presentation. I've got a suspicion, and it's very difficult to prove, but I've got a suspicion that less of these sovereigns survive than we actually think. Because I've been watching the online auctions now for more than a year, and it's interesting. The Kruger coins come up quite frequently, the Kruger Ponda, but you really see there at the beginning, after this book and after my presentation initially there at Gauteng, there were one or two full sets of the sovereigns that were offered for sale. But thereafter, it's gone quiet. And I rarely see any of these sovereigns up for sale now, unless the people hoard them and hope the prices go up now with more publicity caused by the book. I don't know. If you look at the total mintage, the total graded numbers of the South African sovereigns on both NGC and PCGS, it's approximately the same as the total number of graded Paul Kruger gold coins, which is
Yep.
interesting because you would expect there would be many more sovereigns. So are these sovereigns then as rare as the Kruger coins?
Yeah, I see that you said a fair chunk of it went to Australia and India. Now, one of the things that we must take into cognizance here is that the sovereign was a very famous jewelry item, and they used it in a lot of jewelry in India as well as South Africa in Indian jewelry.
That's possible as well. And I vaguely remember I read something that there were a lot of these sovereigns were actually melted in India for some reason or the other as well. And another big melting took place when everybody stepped off the gold standard. And then very soon after that, there was a second law in America, and Roosevelt actually devalued the US dollar from, what was it now, 27 to 35 US dollars. So what was that now, per ounce? Then everybody could make a huge amount of money by exporting their gold to the US because they could get much more money for their gold. So apparently there wasn't enough ships. That's I wrote it somewhere in the book. Enough ships to carry all this gold to the US.
Yeah.
And the US, of course, didn't want all these coins in coin form, and all of them were melted into bars. And that's where all these coin bars in Fort Knox is coming from. There's two different types of bars in Fort Knox. There's the with only 90% gold, which is the American gold coins that were melted. But then there's the gold bars with a higher percentage of gold, and that's all the British and European coins that were melted. So a lot of our sovereigns probably actually ended up there in he's probably lying in Fort Knox in bar form. And everybody probably saw some of the news articles that they actually want to audit the gold in Fort Knox now, and there's some rumors that some of that gold is missing. So that would be interesting to see if they actually do it. But some of our sovereigns most definitely actually ended up in Fort Knox.
Well, I've got a task now. Every single Indian wedding I'm going to attend, if I see a lady wearing a sovereign, I'm going to ask her to show me the date on the coin. If it's a 24, I'm making a good offer.
Okay, your chances of getting a 24 is incredibly rare.
Yeah, that's true. But Francois, thank you again, man. Once again, I think this has been a fascinating journey of the sovereign. Your book has been exceptional, and I think for those people that's going to listen, I think Francois mentioned, if he gets enough requests, he'll do a second run of the book, but it's got to be worthwhile in terms of doing the print. So you can either contact Francois or you can mail me, and I'll send him the details. But 60 books is all that was printed. Francois, thank you again for your time this morning. I know your time is valuable. You're still at the office, but it's been a pleasure having you on the show. And I think this is going to go down very well with the numismatic community. And I hope to see you up in Gauteng next month.
Fantastic. I'll definitely see you there at the meetings and at the show, and I'm looking forward to it. So thank you very much, Anthony.
Cheers, Francois.
Okay. Bye-bye.